Hello, everyone. This is Stephen with Democracy Demythologized, and today I'm talking with Dr. Terry Moe. Dr. Moe studies presidential power, something that's particularly relevant right now with what we're seeing with the current presidency. The current power grabs we're seeing under Donald Trump definitely seem unprecedented, but they're part of a longer history of Republican presidents, in particular, trying to take power and movement to try to solidify power in the president as kind of a all-powerful authoritarian dictatorship. And that's what Dr. Moe is talking about. He recently wrote a book about this called The Trajectory of Power and the Rise of the Strongman Presidency. And that's what we're talking about. So if you want to learn more about this aspect of US history, I would definitely recommend you check it out. Without further ado, let's get started. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Terry Moe. How are you doing today?
Doing just fine. How are you doing, Stephen?
I'm doing well. Yeah. So you're a scholar who's done a lot of analysis of politics. You recently came up with a book. Want to make sure I'm going to read the title just to make sure I say it right. Trajectory of Power: The Rise of the Strongman Presidency. Talking about a lot of the kind of the history of the presidency. Maybe let's get started with, before we talk about that in a little more detail, let's get started with what made you interested in studying politics, and maybe what made you interested in trying to understand like presidential power and bureaucracy and the things that you have studied within politics.
Well, for whatever weird reasons, I was interested in politics and the presidency when I was very little. I think maybe my dad was interested in politics. He used to talk to me about President Eisenhower and the elections coming up and all that stuff, and I was into it, right? So from the time I was a little boy, I would follow presidents, and I had a game of the presidents, where each president had a little medallion with his picture on it. And so I knew all the presidents, and I was into it in a big way. So I don't know, later on in life, when I went to college, I just never thought I could get a job, studying politics. So I wound up majoring in economics, which I really liked. But I decided in the end that for me, economics was too boring and too technical. And I shifted over to political science and went to graduate school in political science, got a PhD in that. And before long, I was studying the presidency and bureaucracy, which seemed very natural to me. It was what I was really interested in.
Yeah, there we go. I guess there's probably a lot of people that were fascinated by the president when they were a little kid. And I guess for you, it never faded. It just kind of became the thing that you did.
Yep. It's a lifelong thing.
Yeah. So I guess also being a lifelong thing, it's evolved over time. This is something you talk about in the book. Do you maybe want to give a little bit of an overview of how you've been in the book you analyze the presidency particularly from Ronald Reagan to now and presidential power? Do you want to kind of give a high level overview of what you talk about?
Sure. It's really much larger in scope than that. The scope that you've described is big, but this is even bigger.
Yes.
So really the starting point is that the United States is in the midst of a crisis of democracy. And what we try to do in this book is to provide readers with a big picture understanding of how this could have possibly happened in a country like the United States which has long been a beacon of democracy for the entire world. Why did it happen here, of all places? Anyone who tries to explain that, it'd be a natural thing to put the focus on Donald Trump, because he certainly seems to be the cause of this threat to democracy that we're currently under and experiencing. But the fact is, as we show in the book, that the problem goes well beyond Trump and is rooted in fundamental social and political forces in American society that have taken place over many decades. And above all, these developments radically transformed American conservatism and the Republican Party and caused them to become much more extreme, much more anti-system, much more populist, and led them to pursue a presidency of extraordinary power and ultimately a strongman presidency dedicated to taking on the system and ultimately taking it down. To understand why our democracy is now in crisis, it's important to put the focus on these underlying fundamentals and how they have shaped the historical trajectory of presidential power throughout American history, and how it is that they ultimately gave rise to the presidency of Donald Trump and to his strongman presidency. So really, to focus on Trump is to miss most of the story. Most of the story is in these underpinnings that drove what ultimately happened, and he was more a symptom than a cause of this crisis. So what we try to do in the book is to connect the dots. It's a complex set of things that have happened over time. We cover a vast expanse of American history, really going all the way back, to the founding, but focusing mainly on the 20th century and 21st century and on the modern history. And we try to make it understandable, to boil it down to these basic things that are responsible for the crisis we're currently in, and to provide an explanation that is accessible to a wide audience and very readable. And that I think readers will find works for them, and that they can come away thinking, wow, this seems complicated, but actually it's very understandable, and now we get it. If we've done our jobs, that's the way people should feel when they read it. So we hope, people will take a look at it, and that it will turn the light bulbs on.
Yeah, this makes total sense. So I guess what do you I agree with you that what's going on with Donald Trump is very much like it's not out of nowhere. It's very much the building of history over a long period of time. I guess, what do you see as some of the biggest threads leading to this kind of rise in power?
Okay. Well, you hear people talk about the administrative state, and the administrative state actually has a lot to do with it, which would be a surprise to some people. First of all, what is the administrative state? It often gets demonized, but it shouldn't be. The administrative state is really almost all of government, and it consists of all of the agencies and all of the programs that make up a government and that carry out the policies that are passed by the legislature and signed by the president. Right? So, unless you had an administrative state, unless you had all these agencies and programs and all the people that populate them, the career civil service, the appointees and experts, professionals, and so on, unless you have all that, the policies that are passed in the policymaking process don't mean a single thing because they're just words on paper. They need to get executed, carried out, implemented by the administrative state. So that's all the administrative state is, and all democracies have administrative states, right? People on the right demonize the administrative state, but the fact is we need an administrative state if we're going to be a democratic government that works. So, okay, that's a preface. Now, the administrative state in the United States first really emerged during the Progressive Era, which emerged in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And that was sort of the beginning of an active, positive government at the federal level, where government was actually trying to address the many social problems that people wanted to be addressed at the time. I mean, before that, government didn't do much of anything. But in the late 1800s, we had massive industrialization and immigration and urbanization. Society was being hugely transformed. And we had a Congress that was corrupt and was incapable of responding to these situations and doing anything about all the problems that resulted, from urbanization and all the rest, right? So, so we needed a government, the progressives thought, that could do something to help people. We needed to have regulation of drugs. We needed to have regulation of meat packing, because so much of the meat that was processed was contaminated. There were monopolies. There was price fixing. There was child labor. And uncompensated overtime. Workers were abused in a variety of ways, and on and on and on. And these were problems that were minimal or non-existent, 30, 40 years earlier. And so people were saying, we need a federal government that can actually do something about these problems, and that's the way people think today. It's like if something goes wrong, the government needs to do something about that. Somebody's going to get blamed. Okay, so back then, there was no government, really. There was no administrative state, almost nothing. The progressives began creating one. With agencies like the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the Fed, and a number of other agencies, right? This was the beginning. And then soon thereafter came the Great Depression, where people were saying, hey, the government needs to do something, right? We're in a huge depression. Everybody's suffering. 25% of the people are out of work. The government needs to be taking an active role. And that's what Franklin Roosevelt did. That was Roosevelt's New Deal. And so that greatly boosted the administrative state and increased its size and scope. Now, conservatives, from the very beginning in the progressive era, hated the administrative state. They were opposed to big government, to high taxes, to high spending, and to regulation of business. What they wanted was the government of the past, the government that did very little, so they were opposed to the administrative state, and they conjured up images of socialism and totalitarianism and all that. But these conservatives were at the fringes of politics. Republicans were conservative, but they were sort of moderately conservative. There were also others in the Republican Party who weren't very conservative at all. The Jacob Javitzes of the world later on, Chuck Percy. And so the Republican Party was really not controlled by conservatives. The conservatives were at the margins of the Republican Party. And the Goldwater capture of the nomination in '64 was an unusual capture of power by the conservatives just for a while, right? It didn't last all that long. But really, the way to see this is that the Republican Party was very diverse. It was not vehemently opposed to the administrative state. Conservatives were, but the party as a whole wasn't. And there were people like William F. Buckley railing from the sides, trying to marshal the troops and get people to see that this was a move toward totalitarianism and was, taking Americans to the slaughter, basically, and we needed to rise up and do something about it and stop big government. Okay, so this changed in the 1970s when conservatives actually began to gain real power. And, people became sort of less supportive of government, less supportive of taxes, less supportive of spending. Conservatives took advantage of that, and it looked to them like they might actually be able to win the presidency in 1976, but 1980, right? And so conservatives looked around and they said, okay, how can we wage war on this administrative state? And the answer that they drew was sort of a shocking one for conservatives. They decided that, hey, Congress is basically controlled by Democrats. It's not going to do anything. They're the ones who built this administrative state. The courts are not going to do anything because the courts are centered around a jurisprudence that has accommodated the administrative state, said that it's okay, that it's constitutional. The presidency became their major hope. And what they then had as their epiphany was that if they could just get a presidency with extraordinary power, a conservative president with extraordinary power, that president could take on the bureaucracy, the administrative state, unilaterally and control it and subvert it from above. And so conservatives then increasingly began supporting a move toward a presidency of extraordinary power. In the past, the conservatives had always favored like minimal authority for the president, minimal government, and they always railed against FDR and Wilson and others and called them totalitarians because they were strong presidents. And what they wanted was some kind of congressional government that didn't do much. Well, now they were favoring a presidency of extraordinary power and thinking that they could use that president to attack the government from above and undermine it through his own unilateral power. So this was a presidency that would exercise extraordinary power through unilateral power, not through new legislation. Okay, so the next step was Ronald Reagan got elected. And during the Reagan years, the Reagan people developed what's now known as the unitary executive theory. And what the unitary executive theory is, it's at the time, a new theory of constitutional jurisprudence that claims that if you really understand the Constitution, it gives the presidents vast, expansive, unilateral power. And it gives him total control over the executive branch, who gets fired, who gets hired, and everything that people can say and do within the executive branch. He controls everything. And that Congress and the courts, which had traditionally imposed all sorts of constraints on what presidents can do within the executive branch, Congress and the courts needed to stay out. In fact, it was constitutionally illegitimate for them to encroach on the president's turf. This was the president's turf, the executive branch. It was his. And so Congress couldn't, say, create an independent agency whose officials were more difficult to fire because they had fixed staggered terms. According to the unitary executive, the president should be able to fire anybody in the executive branch that they didn't like. And it didn't have to be a firing for cause because the person couldn't do their job. It was just a firing because presidents didn't like them, didn't like their ideology, didn't think they were loyal enough. Out they go. Right? So, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So, the unitary executive was in its infancy during the Reagan years, but this was the first major move to legally justify a presidency of extraordinary power. And this was a conservative operation, right, within the Reagan administration. Okay, so over time, this theory caught on among conservative legal scholars who strengthened it over the years, and it caught on and was used by Republican presidential administrations over the years. And those administrations increasingly put that theory to stronger and stronger use, making more and more extreme claims for what presidents have a right to do, to the point that it has provided the legal basis for Trump's strongman presidency, where Trump says, I have an Article 2, and it says I can do whatever I want. That's the unitary executive in a nutshell. The president unconstrained in exercising unilateral action and running this country. Okay, so one more thing has to do with the incentives that Republicans had to do this. So during, beginning in the 1960s, with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, Southern white conservatives began to move away from the Democratic Party, which had passed those major civil rights laws. And these whites in the South moved toward the Republican Party. And the South, which had always been controlled by Democrats and solidly Democratic, ultimately became solidly Republican. This took decades to happen, but it did happen. As part of that, there was a backlash against the progressive policies of the federal government, right? Its policies on race and on gender, right? And on minorities in general, the rights of minorities, and on religion. So this was a cultural conservatism that really came together in the South and provided a basis for huge grievances against a progressive federal government that, in their view, was imposing all of these unwanted views on them, on this conservative culture. Now, that's one part of this, of the change that was occurring. The other change that was occurring came about starting in about the 1990s with these huge worldwide forces of globalization, technological change, immigration, social diversity, that imposed all kinds of major changes, sort of swept across these countries, not just the United States, but here in the United States, the result of it was that lots of lower and lower middle class workers, blue collar workers, lost their jobs to workers overseas. Manufacturers had to shut down, many of them located in rural communities. Rural communities became decimated. And so there were massive economic consequences that sort of destroyed the economic foundations and the economic security of these constituencies of people, right? giving them a basis for serious grievance against the federal government that, in their view, sat by while globalization and all the rest ravaged them. They wanted a government that would stop that would stand up for them, and it didn't do that. And so that was another basis of this anti-system sentiment. And as part of this thing that was happening with globalization, et cetera, there was a cultural component, because it also involved massive immigration into this country, and many people, especially in rural areas, became convinced that immigrants were coming in, they were taking jobs that should belong to blue-collar whites, and they were also threatening the sort of the traditional white Christian culture of the country. And so, in their view, this was a very, very serious threat to their way of life. And so it was like grievance piled on grievance, and all of these grievances gave way to, or gave impetus to, a populist movement in this country. And that populist movement grew and grew and grew. And that movement was and remains fervently anti-system. Right? This is a system that has failed them. Our system is a democratic system. Democracy has failed them. And what they want, and what progressives actually around the world, populists around the world want, is a strongman who will stand above the usual democratic system, do away with all its cumbersome procedures and laws that just get in the way, and act unilaterally, right, to vent their grievances and do something about them by attacking this decrepit system that they hate and bringing that system down. Okay, so I'll just sort of wrap this up here. Those forces took decades to work themselves out. There were people during the 1990s, Rush Limbaugh, Newt Gingrich, Pat Buchanan, that were pioneers in marshaling the populist troops and growing the movement, but it was still too small and too weak to win elections. And it wasn't until the Tea Party and also the election of our first black president, Barack Obama, that populism really sort of was launched in a way that was truly consequential. And Donald Trump saw this, and, you know, up until that time, Donald Trump he was a political neophyte. He didn't even know if he was a Republican or a Democrat. He didn't have any fixed beliefs. And he could see that something big was brewing. This was a tiger, and he could ride that tiger all the way to the White House. And so he began to craft himself as a populist leader. He wasn't that beforehand. He became that because this was his path to power. He could have become almost anything to try to do that. This is what he saw as his ticket to success, and he was right. Right? And the first thing he did to become a populist favorite was to lead the birther movement, claiming that Obama was born in Kenya and was illegitimate as an American president. Well, that was a complete lie. And it's very clear to any thinking American that it was a lie. And more than likely, Trump knew it was a lie, because it was. But he led that movement. He became very popular among populists for doing that. It got him in the news. And he just kept at it. And in the race for the presidency on the Republican side in 2015 and then 16, Trump was the only one who looked around and saw that this populist constituency was strong enough to propel him to the White House. And so that's how he became the populist strongman. He was the one. As he put it, only I can fix it. I'm your strongman. All the others weren't. There were 16 other candidates. I didn't say that. Trump said that. So he became the populist guy. And he rode populism to the White House. And the rest is history. You know, he became a strong man and all that goes along with that, because that was his ticket to power. And why did he become a strong man? Because the underlying forces were there that provided him with the political power to gain office and to exercise that power. So, anyway, that's sort of the long version. There's a lot more to it, but actually it's not all that complicated. You know, what it comes down to is these basic fundamentals, and how those fundamentals propelled Republican presidents, and especially Donald Trump, along a certain path, and that path was a presidency of extraordinary power, and ultimately a strongman presidency. And we'll talk eventually, I'm sure, about how the Democrats were not on that path.
Yeah,
Democratic presidents don't do this. Republican presidents do.
Yeah, this is very helpful. It's very helpful to understand how, I guess, all the different threats, both the history in terms of presidential power, but also how these different forces coalesced into, I guess, what I'm going to call populist conservatism, of this
Yes.
kind of mix of a strongman presidency with all these other opinions and beliefs and policies and stuff like this. And I do like your interpretation that Trump basically took advantage of that, and a bit of an opportunistic interpretation of Trump. And I think even if someone wants to say, no, Trump really believes in that, if that's their interpretation, then I would say, well, then he became a candidate because of these threads. Like, there could be people who said that, but in a different era, they just wouldn't become a candidate. Yeah, I guess.
I think the important point is that it doesn't matter what Trump really believes.
Yeah.
Because what he's doing is whatever he needs to do.
Yes.
To get where he wants to go, right? And if it means becoming a populist strongman, hey, I'm a populist strongman. If it didn't mean that, he would be something else, right? But the populist strongman thing has worked for him. That's what he's doing, right? So then when it comes down to, well, what should his position be on the demonization of immigrants? Or what should his position be on black people, or on anti-Semitism, right? All of that, I would say, is instrumental. It has nothing to do with whether Trump sits around at night and moralizes about anti-Semitism. I don't think there's a moral bone in his body. It's not about that. It's not about anti-Semitism. It's using anti-Semitism in a way that is politically advantageous. And I think that's what he's done with every single thing.
Yeah, I would agree with this. So, switching over for a second, this is the thing you said at the very end, but switching over for a second to the Democrats, what have the you were focusing on the Republican presidencies, where have the what were their stick? Where did they fall in all of this? Maybe especially since Reagan.
Yeah. Okay. So I think most people who listen to, people like me, people who write about politics, they sort of always suspect that, this is ultimately ideological. You say what you're saying because you're a liberal, and that's all it is. And I have to emphasize, no, that's not what it is. I'm a presidency scholar. My co-author is too. We have been for decades, and what's most important to us, really singularly important, is being correct. We do not want somebody to come along later and show that we were wrong, factually. We do not want to be wrong. So what we're trying to do is to explain what's been going on, explain the rise of the strongman presidency, and do it in a way that will stand up forever, that will be shown to be valid. Okay, so this is not about slandering the Republicans because we hate Republicans and boosting the Democrats because we love Democrats. That is not what this is. This is about trying to understand what's going on. And what's going on is this is asymmetric. Republicans do, in fact, approach presidential power differently than Democrats do. Republicans are pursuing a presidency of extraordinary power, and Democrats aren't. And they're doing that, Republicans are, because this way they can directly attack the administrative state and bring it to its knees. Right? They can do it just through the presidency, and they just cut Congress and the courts out. Right? And so the question is, well, what does all this mean for the Democrats? Okay, so let's talk about the Democrats. For the Democrats, the first thing to realize is they created the administrative state, right? The administrative state is basically made up of agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Trade Commission, the National Labor Relations Board, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and on and on and on. There are some agencies like the Defense Department, State Department, CIA, that are part of the national security foreign policy apparatus, and those are bipartisan, right? Both parties care about those. They want to make sure they're well-staffed, et cetera, right? But the rest of government is made up of the kinds of agencies I just listed. They are progressive, right? Their job is to regulate pollution, to provide food stamps, to people who are poor, right? To provide child care, to provide health care, to protect the rights of minorities, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, conservatives don't like that, right? But for the Democrats, those are their agencies. They were successful in getting these agencies created and the programs behind them created. And they're all established by law. Okay, so this is a key point coming up here, right? They're all established by law. They're provided with funding by law. And so if the Republicans want to come along and say, well, we don't like what they're doing, right? What does that mean? That means that if you don't like what they're doing, then you need to change the law, because they're only, like the EPA is seeking to reduce pollution through regulation because that's its legal mandate. By law, that's what it does. If the rule of law obtains, the EPA will do that. So for Democrats, letting the EPA just do its job means that the EPA will be pursuing liberal objectives, right? Progressive objectives. The Democrats get what they want. They don't need some super powerful president to tell them to do what the law already tells them to do, right? If they just follow the law, then they're going to promote progressive objectives. For the Republicans, though, this is a real problem, because if the rule of law obtains and you respect that, well, there's a legal mandate, and if they just are allowed to pursue their mandate according to law, Republicans lose, right? They get an agency that they hate. So for them, it's not just that they oppose the EPA, it's that they oppose the law. The law is in their way. And so for them, they see the law as an obstacle that needs to be circumvented or ignored or just violated. Because the law is what underpins the entire administrative state, every aspect of it. Okay, so that puts the Republicans in a completely different position from the Democrats. The Democrats have every incentive to uphold the rule of law and to have a president who upholds the rule of law. The Republicans don't. For the Republicans, if the rule of law is upheld, they lose. Right? So they have incentives not to uphold the rule of law. In fact, to undermine the rule of law. That's how they win. Okay, how do you do that? That's hard, right? Because what you need is sheer power. And what political scientists have long known is that it takes a lot less power to protect the status quo than it does to disrupt it. An established status quo is stable, and you need a lot of power to change it. Well, that's what Republicans want. They want a really, really powerful presidency to take it on unilaterally. And the Democrats just don't need that. Because if the agencies just do what they're supposed to do by law, fine, they're good. Okay, so that's why Republican and Democratic presidents are in completely different political situations here. They have different incentives. So, there are a lot of conservatives who like to say, you complain that conservatives are the ones that are the autocrats, they're the ones that are threatening democracy. Well, Democrats do too. The Democrats are just as autocratic as the Republicans are. And, our response is, well, no, they aren't. And the reason is they don't have to be. Right? They can just be normal presidents, and the bureaucracy will behave normally, headed by people who support what they do. And as long as they just behave normally according to law, Democrats win. Right? With Republicans, that's not true. Okay, so it's completely different for Republicans, and that's why Republicans feel that they have to behave autocratically. Democrats don't. So I think it's comforting to a lot of people out there, especially conservatives, to say, well, they both do it. But that is just superficial, right? And I'll point to a few examples like, Obama bombed Libya, or Obama adopted DACA, and that was illegal, and therefore he's just as bad as Trump. Okay, well, the therefore doesn't follow, Trump has behaved in a very authoritarian manner across a variety of dimensions. Obama was basically interpreting a statute in a particular way that he said allowed him to do that. And if the courts ultimately overturned that, which they did eventually, Obama's response was, okay, they have a right to do that. Trump is constantly saying that the courts are illegitimate in what they're doing. And the reason is the law is in his way. Right? So there's a reason for the asymmetry, right? And I think this is an explanation that doesn't have anything to do with my ideology or my co-author's ideology. It's really an attempt to think in a totally empirical, theoretical way about what's actually happening here. How do we explain it? And we think this is at the core of the explanation.
Yeah, this makes total sense. It seems like, when you look at it descriptively, I think you kind of have to face the fact that it's not symmetric. It's not the same. I guess, so one thing I wanted to ask about is that, okay, so in your book, you talk about almost like two forms of presidential power or power grabs. One is a bit more like if you look throughout history, the size and of both of the state, of the federal state and the presidency has increased. If you go all the way back to Washington, it's pretty consistently increased over the last several hundred years. And that, in your book, you talk about that is both sides, and both sides do that, and that's been an element of history. And then you talk about this more asymmetric or one-sided power grab.
Can you maybe walk through what's the difference between these two?
Okay. So, the real conflict began to come about during the progressive era, when the administrative state, big government, was being created, right? It was little at the time, but they thought it was big, And so the conservatives hated it and railed against it, but the conservatives were not in control of a political party, and there wasn't much that they could do. And the political parties themselves were pretty diverse. You had liberals within the Republican Party, and you had conservatives within the Democratic Party. They lived in the South, right? So, and this applied for a long time, right? So, basically, the people who really hated the administrative state couldn't do anything about it. And so what you had was, after Roosevelt, so you had Roosevelt, who was elected 4 times, and the administrative state got really big.
Okay, so you mean FDR. I was going to ask you which Roosevelt. Okay.
Yeah. And well, Teddy Roosevelt was a big force, from in the early 1900s, that gave rise to the early administrative state. And then Franklin Roosevelt obviously gave an even bigger boost to the administrative state. But then who followed Roosevelt? Well, there was Truman, who was a Democrat, but then came Eisenhower, 8 years. But Eisenhower, he could have stood up and said, okay, I hate the administrative state. I'm going to attack it and do everything I can to bring it down. He did the opposite. He said, this country needs a social safety net, like Social Security, right? And I think the American public favors this. And so, I don't want to bust the budget, but I do think that we do need to have an active federal government. It does need to provide people with goods and services and solve social problems. And so I'm on board with that. We just need to do it in a more responsible, more budget-friendly way. Okay, so the conservatives were like apoplectic about that. William Buckley hated Eisenhower. But William Buckley was not in control of the Republican Party. Eisenhower was. Okay, so even when Nixon got elected as president, which was in 1969, Nixon started out as an Eisenhower-like president who was going to govern responsibly and make it sort of like a business, and he did that for the first term, roughly, right? So, and that brought us into the 1970s. Okay, so once we got into the 1970s, conservatives were becoming much more powerful, right? And it was at that point that things began to change. And once conservatives became powerful, that's when they realized that if they had the presidency, and they could win the presidency, they thought, the presidency alone could use unilateral power to take on the bureaucracy, the administrative state, and really bring it to its knees. But they needed a legal basis for that, which is where the unitary executive theory came from. So that's the basic transition there. So up until then, presidents were basically presidents, right? And so you didn't have a unitary executive theory. You didn't have Republicans running around saying, let's tear the government down, because anybody who said that was not at the center of the Republican Party. They were on the fringe. Goldwater was on the fringe. He lost by 20 points, what presidents basically did back then was they all wanted power. They all wanted to be great. They had a lot of similarities, these presidents, Republican and Democratic presidents. They weren't doing nothing, but as the administrative state grew, what that meant was that there were agencies and programs within the administrative state that did all kinds of things, provided all kinds of benefits to people. And presidents could see that if they could control those agencies and what they did, they could affect national policy, and they could also affect who got what, right? And so presidents then saw the administrative state as a source of their power during that time. And what they needed was an institutional apparatus that would allow them to exercise that power more effectively. And that's where the institutional presidency came from, which was built incrementally over the years. And we talk about that in the book. So like the executive office of the president, the Office of Management and Budget, the White House counsel's office. So anyway, there are many of these units that make up the institutional presidency, but they all, in one way or another, allow the presidency to function as an organization to control the bureaucracy, pretty much. And then by controlling the bureaucracy, they're controlling all these experts and professionals and programs to get things done as they want them done, right? So all presidents sort of focused on that, and that was normal presidency, and they all did it. But nobody was behaving as an authoritarian, right? There were no strongman presidencies at that time, right? They were all, with a few exceptions, they were all just playing within the rules, right? You can say that, Johnson went off the grid, with Vietnam, and, Eisenhower went off the grid by invading Guatemala and some of these countries, right? And that's true. But by and large, presidents were accepting the democratic rules of the game, and they played within accepted bounds. They were all normal presidents, right? And so if you study the presidency, it made it possible to talk about the presidency, and to talk about presidents. And it didn't start out by saying, well, you got Republican presidents, you got Democratic presidents. It didn't need to do that because they were all, in fundamental respects, the way they approached power, the same. They just had different policies and different coalitions. But once the Republicans started pursuing a presidency of extraordinary power, that changed the game, right? Because all of a sudden they wanted to engage in unilateral action in extreme. They wanted to run everything from the top. And they made these claims about the law that most people rejected, which basically said, yeah, presidents can do whatever they want. It's like, really? Is that what James Madison would say? I don't think so. So that's when things changed. But it's very important, as you say, that up until that point, it wasn't like that. And Republican and Democratic presidents were pretty much alike in the way they approached power.
Yeah, this makes total sense. It seems like the strongman presidency now is a pretty specific movement that with a pretty specific ideology that goes against what the government has become over the last several decades. I guess one other question I wanted to ask you was, what do you see as the implications of all this for democracy in the U.S.? I know that's a big question, but we're currently living in a Trump second presidency. It seems like every other thing he does is a power grab, or is at least an attempt of a power grab. How do you see all this playing out?
This is very bad with what's happening, and it's also deeply rooted. So I think a lot of people think, okay, if we can just get rid of Trump, everything will be okay. Well, it won't be. And if you just follow the thread of what I've been talking about, there are these fundamental forces out there that have been operating for decades that have led to great hostility and grievance among populists toward the federal government and toward democracy, because democracy, in their view, doesn't work for them. Right? So they very much want a strongman like Trump to vent their grievances, to stand up for them, and to enact policies that they want, but that Congress won't produce and the courts won't produce. So let's get a president to do it, and he can act unilaterally. He'll speak for the people, right? Those forces are still there. They're not going to go away. So let's say things go as planned, and in 2028, Trump doesn't somehow upset our electoral system and he doesn't run, and he's like off the table. Okay, so we'll get some other Republican running for president. Is that Republican going to be dramatically different from Trump? I would say no. And the reason is the fundamental forces are the same, right? There's still going to be this seething mass constituency that hates the federal government, and that hates progressivism, that hates the Democrats, and really wants a strongman that will stand above all these democratic constraints that just get in their way and take action on behalf of the people. That will still be there. So what will Republican politicians who want to be president do? I would say they will conform to those incentives. I mean, look at J.D. Vance, for God's sake. You know, he out-Trumps Trump. Why? Because that's what their constituency wants to hear. And I think it would be very surprising if some other more moderate candidate rises up, says, let's go to the center, let's be more moderate. I don't think so. Right? So if we're right on this, and we talk about it in the book, and if this constituency continues, and I don't see why it wouldn't, where would it go? Why would it go away? They still have all kinds of grievances. And they're especially going to have grievances if Trump is no longer in office and they don't have a champion in office. That's the last thing they want. They need to have a champion. So I would say they're not going to go away. And that means that's going to shape the behavior of Republican politicians going forward. How long that'll last, we can't say. But for the foreseeable future, they're going to be there. And the mistake that people make is in personalizing all this, and thinking that, it's really just about Trump, so when he's gone, or it's really just about J.D. Vance, and when he's gone, that is superficial, right? You got to look beneath the surface. What's really going on? What's underneath there? Why are these people behaving as they are?
Yeah.
So that's the problem going forward. Right there.
Yeah, this makes total sense. I mean, I do think, the two elements of it, the charisma is unique to Donald Trump. And with populists, that side is important. And it's pretty historically the case that when that populist goes away, whether they die or they just become not a factor anymore, that aspect does die until a new person comes up. But but also there's aspects of the movement and there's aspects of what's going on underneath and the incentives that are there's I guess the infrastructure is still in place within the conservative group, and that part would not go away at all. And I agree with you that is what ultimately, unfortunately, matters more, and that's the scary part. Like, that's still the orientation that will still probably be the orientation of this side, at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people out there who talk about our politics by saying that Trump is a cult figure, that this is like a cult. And I wish they wouldn't do that. Because it personalizes the whole thing. What really matters is that there are all these people who not only have grievances and who hate progressivism and wokeness and all the rest, and who demand, that their grievances be addressed. There's that, and behind all that is something very real. If you look at the policies of the federal government, they are progressive policies. They have stood up and stood up for and promoted the rights of minorities, and DEI, and doing something about climate change as we destroy the planet, and all the rest, right? So these grievances that they have are real because they're mad about something that's actually happening. Also, globalization really did decimate a lot of jobs and industries. Okay, they're mad about that. They lost businesses, they lost jobs, they got hurt. That's real. So if Trump leaves the stage, does that change that? No, they still have lost their jobs and lost business, right? So I think a lot of these things are durable. And what they want is a series of leaders who can do something about it. And until then, they are mad, and they're anti-system. It's a system that doesn't work for them. And that's why they can support a strongman.
Yeah, this makes sense. That reminds me of something I actually did want to ask you about. So I think one element of the current populist conservative movement, or whatever you want to call it, is that it's taken this kind of desire for a strongman presidency, and in some of these grievances over like the environment and helping minorities and stuff like that, and it took that, but then you also have like legitimate frustrations among lower class people in the United States, particularly lower class white communities and lower class rural communities. Or I guess, I'm sorry, I should say working class. I'm sorry, I'll not lower class, working class in this particular case, and those are distinct in how they're defined. I said the wrong one, but like those in a previous book, you talked about some of those, and you talked about how some of these like inequalities are legitimate grievances, and it seems like there's a bit of a like this group has kind of aligned themselves with this form of conservatism and the strongman presidency and some of these kind of aspects. And I'm a little curious, like, why do you think that happened? And what do you think about that? Because, like, to me, it's not in any way intuitive that somebody that is concerned about, the inequalities in their rural community, for example, would necessarily like that any aspect of a strongman presidency with Donald Trump, that would be a very good solution to that. But at the same time, that's kind of where most people are at in that position. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that? And what's the as you analyze it, like what have you learned?
Well, it's been a theme among people who study this for a long time, that many of these people are voting against their own material interests. And, I think a lot of people don't like to hear that, but I think that there's also a lot to it. And the first book that really did this in a big way is a book by Thomas Frank called What's the Matter with Kansas? And it was like, okay, you got all these people in Kansas who are voting Republicans, and yet the Republicans are adopting all these policies that are bad for people in Kansas. Why is that? Why do they keep voting for these guys? And a lot of it comes down to the cultural dimension of what the Republican Party stands for. For opposing progressivism, opposing minority rights, supporting religion, and all the rest. And then they do stuff like cutting taxes so that they can't actually support social services, and somehow they're able to do that and still get elected because people like them for these other reasons. So I think that there's a lot of that going on. I think it still goes on, because here Trump has engaged in policies, adopted policies that overwhelmingly benefit his billionaire buddies, and so people who are already rich are getting an awful lot richer, under Trump. And yet all the other things he's done about trying to obliterate DEI, about punishing his political enemies, about demonizing minorities, and just being a tough guy, right? All of these things his popular supporters like. And so it's like, who knows what they think exactly about everything he does to benefit rich people, but they like these other things that he does. They feel that he says things that they believe, he does things that they like, and they just dismiss everything else. But the everything else includes policies that are enormously beneficial to rich people and that actually hurt working class people. But somehow that doesn't register.
Yeah.
And you really have to recognize that most voters on either side are not very well informed. And these policy issues are complicated. And you have a lot of battling voices out there. So you have Republicans, conservatives disproportionately watch Fox News. And they get a lot of their news from conservative outlets. And those outlets are feeding them interpretations of what's happening that make Trump look good, right? To these lower class and lower middle class constituencies, right? And it's all strategic. They're trying to make him look good. This is not news. It's a propaganda network that they have. So I think that also plays a huge part in all this.
Yeah, this makes total sense. I could definitely see what you're saying. I mean, this might be my opinion, but I think if there's any way to drive an effective wedge in this movement, it would be to separate those two. Because if you separate those two, then you remove, like, you're still going to have conservatives that want a strong unified presidency, but you remove a more popular following of that, and you remove the ability for them to win elections. But that might be easier said than done, and that might not be a realistic path at all. So I guess that was another question I wanted to ask you. What do you think we can do about this?
Well, first of all, our book is not a book about what we can do about it.
Yes.
We do talk a bit about that.
A lot of academics don't focus on that angle because it's a hard angle.
Well, actually, I think a lot of them do, but it's always the least convincing part of the book.
Yes.
It's like, okay, how can we make things better? Okay, well, we think people should participate more. We think people should learn more about their. Okay, these are like totally impractical. They're not going to happen, so don't even talk about those things, right? You should be talking about things that are possible. All right, so a couple of things are possible. One is that the Democratic elites, the people who are in power in the Democratic Party, as a matter of strategy, can see that what they need to do is to make government more effective, And so this is the abundance argument, the Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson argument from their book Abundance. And their argument is that, Democrats' hearts are in the right place. They want to help people. But they put up so many rules and regulations and restrictions saying you can't actually get anything done, and they allow, for instance, existing homeowners to exercise a veto over whether there are going to be any new houses in their neighborhoods, right? So you can't actually build houses like low-income housing and stuff like that because they always get vetoed. So I think there are strategies that could be followed by enlightened democratic politicians that will do away with a lot of the red tape and rules and restrictions that get in the way of development and actually make government more effective. So that's one thing. The other thing, which is they have to be beaten at the ballot box. And a key to that, I would say, is what a big part of their politics now is trying to destroy the federal government, right? And that's what Doge was all about with Elon Musk, and Trump has continued that. They're devastating agencies, they're devastating programs, they're firing career civil servants and professionals and experts. And the bottom line is going to be government's just not going to be able to perform. Government's not going to be able to, you're going to call Social Security and nobody's going to answer the phone. Okay, so how are people going to like that? They're not. So I think one possibility is, as this thing plays out, and you have emergencies and there is no FEMA to come to the rescue, then people are going to be mad, and they're going to be mad at Trump and the Republicans, just like they're going to be mad at Trump and the Republicans because these healthcare costs are going up right now, the amounts that people have to pay. And that, from an electoral standpoint, that's terrible for them and good for the Democrats. So it may well be that exactly because the Republicans are doing what they're doing and destroying the government, the Democrats are going to come out of this in good shape because people are going to react negatively to a government that doesn't perform, right? They call Social Security, they want someone to answer the phone. So I think it's possible that the Republicans will pay a price. And if they do, and if they start losing, then the next step is, okay, there may be Republicans who look at this and go, we can't do that anymore. This is a loser. We have to be different in order to stop losing. So if it's possible to get them to the point where they're losing elections, they would have to make decisions about what they're going to do going forward. And that could change them. So there's hope there. Also, if they don't change, they'll just keep losing. Okay, great. So either way, it doesn't look good for them. But another thing, I don't mean to just keep blabbering here, but another thing is that they're trying to change the election rules, and change them in a way that even if people are discontent, their votes don't count, right? So they can't actually get Republicans out of office. That's what all this gerrymandering is about, right? So they will do everything they can. And voter ID law, same thing. Trying to prevent people from voting, trying to make sure that the kinds of people who might vote Democratic can't vote. And that's what Republican electoral politics has been all about for, maybe 15 years.
Yeah, this makes total sense. I mean, the optimist in me thinks that, this like cutting key services and things and some of this stuff will result in a pushback that kind of kills this type of movement, or allows the movement to kind of run out of oxygen in terms of electoral support. The cynic in me thinks like, oh no, when people are upset about their programs being cut, they will go run to, they'll believe a Trump narrative or a conservative narrative, and they'll blame the other side or something, and they'll misattribute why healthcare is going up or FEMA's going up or something like that. FEMA's not there. And between that and the voting changes, this will become like a self-fulfilling feedback loop that will only get worse. That's what the cynic says in me. Which one do you think, or something else, which side do you think will win out? Like, do you think this movement will plateau and kind of eventually shift to something else or crash? Or do you think this will just continue to build, and this will just be the direction that the United States goes?
Well, this is very unscientific, so I don't know. We're guessing, right?
Any forecasting is.
So I guess what I would say is more than likely the government will perform worse as time goes on. It will perform worse because of things the Republicans have done that have been well publicized. And I think people actually want a government that works. And you never really appreciate government when it's there, but when it's gone, you suddenly see you need FEMA, and you need these other government organizations to help you. You need a CDC, to tell us something about vaccines. You need an FDA to keep bad drugs off the market, and on and on and on. So I think as time goes on, people do want effective government, and B, I think as government goes down, people won't like that, and they will ultimately say, bring back government. We need a party that will champion government and make government work well. So I think if Democrats can pivot to be the party of effective government, but still the party of government, I think that should work well for them. So I think that's the ray of sunshine, at the end of the day. I'm hoping that it is.
There we go. That actually relates to the final question I was going to ask you, which was, for anyone interested in learning more about your work, where can they go? So obviously that is both where can they go to find out about this book, and then also where can they go to find out about some of your other books and research too?
Well, I think the single place to go is this book.
Yes.
Trajectory of Power, The Rise of the Strongman Presidency.
Yeah.
We've written other things over the years. We had another book in 2020, which is about the president's populism and the crisis of democracy. So it sounds a lot like this book, except that this book is much more comprehensive in attempting to look over the entire history of presidential power and explain how it is that presidential power has grown to be so expansive that it has actually gotten to the point that it can bring democracy down. How did that happen? And what it requires is a grand scope of analysis to take it all in. There's a lot in there, but I think it all fits together logically, step by step, in a way that anybody can understand, and that, in my view, provides an accurate, enlightening account of presidential power. And it's not just about Trump; it's about the whole thing, and how Trump sort of emerged at the end. How did that happen? And what's likely to happen after he's gone? Because there's a logic that drives this whole thing, that anyone can understand. So, William and I have been teaching and studying and writing about the presidency for decades. I hate to admit it, but we have. And in both our view, this is the most important thing we've written and the most comprehensive thing. It's like we took everything that was in our brain and put it down in a straightforward way that organizes everything and explains it to everybody, you know. So we're really happy that we finally had a chance to do this in our careers. And, you know, we hope that people learn from it, you know, and pay attention to it. I know today a lot of people just don't read books. They don't. You know, they read blogs and stuff like that. But it's too bad, you know, because in a book you can really say a lot, and you can like provide an account of hundreds of years of really interesting developments and do it in a way that makes real logical sense step by step. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And it's simple. There it is. And my fear is that there are a lot of people who just don't read and think they can, you know, read something that's 5 minutes long and understand. And you can't do that. You need to just sit down with books and take the time, read the book, you know, and then you come away with a much deeper understanding.
Yeah, I could understand that. I could understand the value of taking a thinker and sitting down with their thought for a longer period, especially something that's kind of a synthesis of that person's thought over their lives, over their many decades, and that's an incredibly valuable thing. And I think that's one of the big things lost sometimes in looking at shorter media, is that it's much more the conversation of the moment. I think you can sometimes get less of that. This is what the person this is a synthesis of a person's process over a long period, because there's a lot to be learned from engaging with people's thoughts over their lifetimes, let's just say, because there's a lot of meat in that, and it can be worth reflecting on. So everyone, I think I do agree, everyone should check out your book, The Trajectory of Power. You guys do have some other books that I do like as well, but maybe that I agree that this is probably a good first book to start with.
I think people should start there. One thing, you know, in the past, it probably didn't matter that much because, as we say, there was this normal presidency, and you could talk about the presidency, and it made sense. If you were talking about Nixon, fine. If you were talking about FDR, fine, or Woodrow Wilson, okay. They're all presidents. They're all sort of behaving like presidents. And they were like these parameters that help you understand how presidents behave. But that's not true anymore. You know, and so in order to understand like Donald Trump or even George W. Bush, I think you need to think about things differently. Right? So this is a moving train, you know, and trying to write a book when the train is moving is really hard. It's like we finished this book at the end of 2024, after the election. We delayed it until after the election so we knew who won. But we never got to see Trump's first or his second term. So all we had was our analysis that basically said, okay, here's this whole analysis explaining the rise of the strongman presidency. This guy is going to become president again. It's going to be bad, right? So we could say, look, he's going to be unhinged, especially because of the immunity decision. God help us all. But we didn't actually get to see it, right? So that's the moving train part. So now it's been a year, right? Because, I mean, the book had to go into production, right? And it has to be copy edited and all that stuff. That takes months. Meantime, things are happening in the world. So it's unfortunate that it happens that way, but we feel good that our book actually captured what was happening. You know, I think that our explanation is right about this. So anyway, if you go back to 2020, a lot more has happened, in between 2020 and this book, 2025. So I think that a lot of that book was an effort to get people to understand populism and where it came from, and why effective government was such an important force in creating populism and creating so much anti-government sentiment, and that connects to our earlier book, which is Relic, which was about how the Constitution actually undermines effective government. The books are connected.
Yeah, this makes sense. It's very interesting to look at both. I mean, people talk about how completely unprecedented the second term of Trump is, but it really isn't. And it can be interesting even to look at predictions in the late 2024, because a lot of the stuff he did, some of the details may not have been predicted, but a lot of it was pretty predictable. And actually something you said did connect to another one aspect that I think is a big fear. So, which is the courts and like the immunity. So like, I remember at another point in this conversation, you were talking about how, the position among the conservatives at the time, this was several decades ago, was that, Congress will never do this thing that they want. The courts will never do this thing that they want, so the president's got to do it. But at least as of now, it seems like the courts, at least the Supreme Court, is as much on board with some of this stuff. And, at the present moment, Congress seems to be too, but Congress could flip-flop every couple years, because Congress just does that. But the courts, it seems like they're going to be, it doesn't seem like they're going to change anytime soon. The Supreme Court specifically will change anytime soon. And I think that's another scary aspect, that the movement in and of itself it's all about the executive, and the executive is on board with it, but it really seems like a two branch of government. It's both the Supreme Court and the president that are pushing for this type of changes. And I think that's another ultra scary aspect.
Very, very much so. This whole business about separation of powers has pretty much been shown to be built on sand. It doesn't really work when you're presented with a real autocrat, especially when he knows what he's doing. I don't know that Trump knows anything, but he's surrounded now by people who do know a lot, who are very sharp, and are making this thing happen. What you said about the courts, what the founders wanted was for these branches to check one another, right? But then look at what you have with the courts. These six are wedded, they wouldn't say so, but they are, to the unitary executive theory, right? And so that theory says that the Constitution vests in the president vast, expansive unilateral power that's essentially unconstrained by Congress and the courts, and can't be constrained. Okay, and that should be the law. Okay, what is the law normally? The way that the framers thought about the law was that the law exists to constrain members of government from doing things you don't want them to do, right? And so the laws are constraints. And what the Supreme Court is doing is lifting constraints on presidents, right? And basically creating what amounts to a lawless situation where what they're saying, in effect, is, Congress can't come in and do anything to restrict your removal power. You can do whatever you want. And so, and the same is true here and here and here. And what we're really saying is there are no laws for you that can constrain what you're doing. So you can just do whatever you want. you have an Article 2 and you can do whatever you want, just like Trump said, right? And so the weird thing is they're creating a body of law in which the law is unconstraining and therefore really doesn't function in the way laws are supposed to function, but instead liberates the president to do whatever he darn well pleases. And this is happening because years ago, the conservatives developed this unitary executive theory during the Reagan years, and conservative judges and legal scholars embraced it, and now they're ascendant. Right now, they have enough power to impose it on the whole country, right through the Supreme Court. And so is the Supreme Court going to check Trump? No. They might do it in particular cases, like the tariff case, we'll see. But that's a very particular case. We could talk about that if you wanted. But in general, they want a powerful presidency, and the epitome of that, the best case of that, is the immunity case. I mean, that is a travesty. In my view, it's a stain on the Roberts Court that Roberts will never, ever, ever live down. It is the most dangerous decision that the court has ever made in its entire history, setting the president up as above the law. Basically, nothing that he can do in his official acts can ever be held accountable or prosecuted. And I can't imagine that the framers would ever have gone along with that. And this Supreme Court with a straight face can nonetheless adopt that opinion. It's just, I think, shocking. But that's where the court is nowadays. You know, the president can do what he wants. You can't hold him accountable. All right, no democratic system can work that way.
Yeah,
Accountability is at the heart of it.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, the Supreme Court seems to want this, at least the majority in the Supreme Court. And then, yeah, I think this case, it seems like in each era, there are key cases that historically are looked upon as very bad decisions, like the Dred Scott case, maybe Plessy versus Ferguson, cases like that. But I agree. I think this one, history will look back on and say this was definitely the worst of this era. And I agree with you. It could well be the worst ever in U.S. history. That might not be an exaggeration. That might literally be what history says of it. It's very sad.
Yeah.
And I part of me, I mean, the electoral process, like what you said at the beginning, people might swing in the direction of, oh no, we actually do, the federal government does all these beneficial things, and get angry at, Trump and the Republicans for basically getting them. But I think as long as that's in place, there will always be it's not just a path, but a very easy path to authoritarianism.
To what?
As long as that Supreme Court case is the official decision of, or the official interpretation of the Constitution, there will always be not just a path, but an easy path to authoritarianism for a future president.
Yes. And for this president.
Yes.
I think he's behaving as an authoritarian right now.
He definitely is.
I mean, this is what it looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's not taking most ordinary citizens out of their home and throwing them in prison, but he's doing things that look like that to immigrants.
Yeah.
Having masked agents tackle them in the streets, no due process, and take them away. And I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think he's behaving in an authoritarian way in many, many, many different ways. And if we had more time, we could just go into that, because I think that is where his strongman presidency has gone. And he has just unleashed, right? He is the strong man. He's exercising power in whatever ways he wants, whatever whim may move him at any given moment, and God help everybody else.
Yeah,
So I think this is what it looks like in our society anyway.
Yeah, I agree, and yeah, I mean, maybe we'll have to have a second conversation where we talk about more details on the Trump presidency, because this one we focused on the history, but I do absolutely agree with that. I guess for now, thanks for taking the time to talk, and I think this has been a very helpful, very eye-opening conversation. It's both necessary to what we were talking about at the end to understand what's happening now, but it's also, to reference the beginning, it's also helpful to understand even what Trump's doing is awful, but it still has a history behind it, and it's still a build-up of what a lot of other presidents, maybe particularly Republican presidents, have done, like you talk about in your book.
Well, it has been asymmetric, and that's an important theme. Yeah, it's really Republican presidents doing this, and when Democrats have violated what we might think of as democratic bounds, it's been a thing or two here and there. Obama bombs Libya, for instance. Okay, he did that. And he probably shouldn't have done that. I mean, I think that what he did might have been illegal. But that hardly puts him in the same class as Trump, who has so many of those transgressions against the law, you couldn't even count them all. Right? This is his whole approach to the presidency. And so I think some people on the right try to make themselves feel better and absolve Trump of any responsibility by saying, oh, well, they all do it. Well, they don't all do it. You can find an example or two here or there. That's just misleading. Right? Look at the big picture. Look at what's happening here. Right? Trump is basically thumbing his nose at the rule of law, and he is an anti-democratic leader who wants to govern unilaterally, and that is not the way Obama or Clinton or Biden or other Democrats have ruled. And this is not because they're wonderful people and that's why they're doing it. I think it's because Democrats have completely different incentives when it comes to how they govern than Republicans do, and it so happens that for historical reasons, Republicans have incentives to pursue a presidency of extraordinary power and ultimately a strongman presidency. And Democrats do not have those same incentives.
Yeah.
It comes down to.
This makes total sense. Well, thanks for taking the time to be able to outline this for us.
Sure.